Welcome to the Folktale Project. This is Dan Scholz. Today we have a new story, and this tale is a listener suggestion. The book itself is absolutely wonderful, The Talking Cat and Other Stories of French Canada, and a storybook that I honestly would not have found if it wasn't for Liz. So Liz, thank you so much for suggesting this. I've really started to appreciate the stories, and I'm going to start at the beginning of the book. This tale is very cute. There is a slightly problematic depiction of an indigenous person in the story, but honestly, in a storybook from 1952, it's really not bad. This is The Skunk in Tante Odette's Oven. Once, in another time, my friends, an old woman named Tante Odette lived in Canada. She was a plump little woman with beady black eyes, a poof of a mustache, and a double chin. She lived at the edge of the village in a neat whitewashed house with a sharp roof and 2 dormer windows. Tante Odette was all alone except for the beasts in her barn and Shoo-Shoo, the big gray cat who lived in the house with her. She worked her own little field and cared for her beasts all by herself because she was too stingy to pay anyone to help her. For this reason, things did not always go smoothly for her. The ox broke through the fence, or the well froze over, or the roof began leaking. There was that Tuesday morning that she got up very early to start the fire in her outdoor oven. The fat loaves were rising nicely in the pans, the weather was pleasant, and there was plenty of dry wood for the fire. It looked like a day in which everything would go right from the beginning to end. Tante Odette gathered a load of wood in her arms and carried it over to the oven. She laid it down in a neat pile and picked up a stick. She noticed that the oven door had been left open, so she poked her stick inside to see that no leaves or twigs had blown in. The stick would not go in very far because something was in the way. The old woman stooped lower and peered into the dark depths of the oven. The sight that met her eyes caused her to scream and slam the door shut. She went running out of her yard and down the road as fast as her bunions and old bones would take her. At Albert Roberge's farm, she saw Albert drawing water from the well. "Albert, Albert!" she cried breathlessly. "Come quick! There's a skunk in my oven!" Albert let the bucket sink back into the well. He stared at Tante Odette in astonishment. "Are you sure it's a skunk?" he asked. "Perhaps it is your cat." "Believe me," said Tante Odette, "if that skunk had turned his weapon on me, you would not have to ask such questions. Of course it is a skunk. Is my Shoo-Shoo a black cat with a white stripe down his back?" Then, as Albert stood there as stupidly as Francois Zicret's simple son René, she explained the whole matter to him. "I came out early to start the fire in my oven," she began. "I carried a load of wood in my arms like this. I laid it down over there. I picked up this stick, see? The oven door was open, so I poked the stick inside, but something was in the way. It was a skunk. A skunk in my oven." At last, Albert Roberge seemed to understand. "I will come right over as soon as I draw a bucket of water," he promised. Tante Odette returned and hurried back to the road, but she did not go home. She headed for the farm of Jean Labadie. If 2 heads were better than 1, 3 would be even more dependable. Jean Labadie was on his way to his hen-house with a pail of chicken feed in his hand. Tante Odette panted up to him. Jean Labadie!" she cried. "Come quickly, there's a skunk in my oven." Jean Labadie regarded her politely. "Are you sure it is a skunk?" he asked. "Perhaps it is a scrap of old fur coat that you threw away." Tante Odette was becoming quite exasperated with her neighbors. When faced by an emergency, they seemed even more simple-minded than René Eclet, who went slapping through the fields, talking to the birds and bushes. "Of course it is a skunk," she insisted. "Would I throw away a scrap of anything? Am I such a spendthrift?" Albert had to agree that she was anything but a spendthrift. "I went out early to start the fire for my baking," she went on. "I carried a load of wood in my arms like this. I laid it down over there. I picked up the stick, see? The oven door was open, so I poked the stick inside, but something was in the way. It was a skunk in my oven." Tante Odette moaned and wrung her plump hands. "I will come over as soon as I have fed the chickens," promised Jean Labadie. Then the old woman turned and limped toward Andre Drouillard's farm. The wits of her neighbors seemed unusually dull on this fresh morning that had turned sour so unexpectedly. She would need all the heads she would like to knock together. Andre Drouillard was just coming out of his back door. He looked surprised to see Tante Odette calling at such an hour, for the old woman was not given to neighborliness. "Andre Drouillard," she wheezed, "come quickly. There's a skunk in my oven." "Are you sure it is a skunk?" blinked Andre. "Perhaps you saw a shadow inside as you opened the door." Tante Odette was outraged. "Does a shadow have a bushy tail?" she demanded. "Does it have 2 shiny black eyes? Does it grit its teeth at me? No! It was this way. I went out early to start the fire in my oven. I carried a load of wood in my arms like this. I laid it down over there. I picked up this stick. See? The oven door was open, so I poked my stick inside, but something was in the way, and it was a skunk." Andre's face brightened. "Why didn't you tell me that at first?" he asked. "I will come right over." So as long as her breath came and went, Tante Odette stumbled from farm to farm seeking help. And everyone came quickly, for although a skunk in one's oven is a calamity, a skunk in the oven of one's neighbor is an interesting diversion. Not since the past Sunday had so many people traveled down the dusty road. Albert Roberge and his family were the first to arrive. Jean Labadie came on their heels. Albert opened the oven door, peered in, and carefully closed it. "It is a skunk indeed," he said. Then Jean Labadie opened the door, peered in also, then closed it just as carefully. "Yes, you are right," he admitted. "It is a skunk." In pairs and threes and fours the people of the parish arrived. There were 5 of the blue-eyed Meloches, making jokes with pretty Eloise Baltanu to make her dimples wink. Henri Dupuis, the storekeeper, who looked as if he had eaten one of the pickles of his own crock, was only 2 skips behind his gossipy wife, Hortense. There were Delphine Langlois, the old maid, and several others who did not matter and certainly would be of no help. And each one must look in the oven for himself, close the door, and name the uninvited occupant a skunk. Since everyone who wanted to help had arrived and no one denied that a skunk was in Tante Odette's oven, it was now time to think of some way to get the skunk out. "I will run home and get my gun," cried Jean Labadie. "I'll put a quick end to that caller." "No, no," howled Tante Odette. "Not in my oven." "Not in the oven," agreed all the others. "She would not be able to bake bread in it for a month, perhaps never." "And it would spoil the pelt," added Albert Roberge, who trapped for the trader and knew what he was talking about. "Perhaps we should get somebody's dog," answered one of the blue-eyed Meloches. "A dog would bark and frighten him out of the oven." "No, no," cried Tante Odette. "The skunk must not be frightened while he was in my oven." Everyone agreed that this was true. A frightened skunk was apt to be a very unpleasant fellow. "Perhaps we should tie a piece of meat on a string and coax him out," said someone else. "Get a piece of meat, Tante Odette." "I have no meat," snapped the old woman, "and I wouldn't waste it on a skunk if I had." So this plan was dropped, because no one else cared to use his meat to coax a skunk out of Tante Odette's oven. "Someone should get the priest," suggested Madame Roberge. "He might know what to do." But others thought that it was more a matter for Dr. Brisson. "He could give him a pill that would put him to sleep," said one. "Then we could carry the skunk out into the woods." "No, no," cried Albert Roberge. "Do not let such a fine pelt get away. I will take care of the skunk once he is asleep." Then the youngest Meloche howled with laughter. "Ha ha ha!" he roared. "And that would be one surprised skunk when he wakes up and finds his skin on Albert Roberge's board and Dr. Brisson's bill in his bare paw." Then everybody but Tante Odette laughed, with a light mood fell upon the crowd. Andre Drouillard was reminded of the time he had worked in the lumber camps and a porcupine had gotten caught in his boot one night. "And believe me, my friends," he added, "a porcupine wedged in a boot makes as big a problem as a skunk in an oven." That promptly set Jean Labadie off on a long tale about a deer that was accidentally shut up in his barn when his cows one winter. "And when spring came, that doe had twin fawns that I raised with my own calves," he ended. If old Gabriel Meloche had been there with his fiddle and Tante Odette's bread already baked, the whole thing could have been a gay fete. Only Tante Odette could not forget the reason that everyone had dropped his work at the start of the morning to hurry to her little farm. "The skunk," she reminded them. "The skunk is still in my oven. How can I break bread today?" One by one, the neighbors walked over to the oven, opened the door, looked surprised to see the skunk still there, then carefully closed the door again. "Yes," said each one in turn. He is still there. And while this was going on, Samagish, the Indian, came riding down the road on his sway-backed pony. When he saw all the people in Tante Odette's yard waiting with the air of those about to sit down to a feast, he dismounted and made his way through the gate. Tante Odette was overjoyed to see an Indian entering her yard. After all, this was more of a problem for one close to nature. "Samagish," she cried, "come help us. There is a skunk in my oven. We need your help." "You show him skunk?" asked Samagish, who had never heard of a skunk in a white man's oven. Bread or venison or ham, yes, but never a skunk. "Of course it's a skunk," said Albert Roberge with disgust, for by this time everyone could see what a foolish question this made. Samagish opened the door, looked in, and carefully closed the door again. "What shall we do?" asked Tante Odette. Samagish licked his lips. "Young, tender skunk," he said. "Anybody got match?" "Oh, no, screamed Tante Odette. "Not in my oven." Everyone tried at once to explain to the Indian that the skunk was not to be cooked. Samagish stared at them in puzzlement. He shrugged his shoulders. "Then why skunk in oven?" he asked. But he did not wait for an answer. Answers never really explained the white man's queer ways. He mounted his sway-backed pony and rode away without another word. By now, all the people were becoming a little bored with the skunk matter, and it did not look as if Tante Odette was going to serve any food or drink. Jean Labadie remembered that he hadn't milked his cow. André Drouillard spoke of the job of cleaning his barn. Madame Roberge said it was long past time for breakfast. It was at this stage that René Eclette, the simple son of Francois, came slapping his feet down the road with his head bobbing like a loose cork. His dull eyes brightened at a sight of the gathering in Tante Odette's yard. Like Samagish, he thought that there was a crowd of people, there must be food. So he turned in. At the time René entered the yard, Tante Odette was quite at the end of her wits. She made one desperate attempt to do something about the skunk in the oven. This, René might be simple-minded, it was true, but it was said that he talked to the birds in the trees. Perhaps he had a way with wild things. The woman went running to him, twisting the folds of her apron. "René," she cried. "René Eclette, there is a skunk in my oven. Can you get him out without frightening him?" René nodded his head gravely. "And he didn't ask, are you sure it is a skunk?" "Then do something," implored Tante Odette. René nodded again. "What will you do?" asked Tante Odette. But René did not answer her. He slapped over to the oven and opened the door. He leaned inside. The people could hear him talking in a low, earnest voice. No one could hear what he said because his head was inside the oven. And no one cared to venture closer to try to hear. There was a tight feeling in the air, and Tante Odette felt it from the knot on top of her head to the bunions on her feet. At last, René stepped back. Everyone stared and stretched his neck. For a few moments nothing happened. Then the sharp face of the skunk appeared in the doorway of the oven. Everybody stepped back a few feet. The skunk clumsily wriggled over the edge and dropped to the ground. Slowly he started through the yard. The crowd respectfully parted to make a wide path for him, a very, very wide path. The skunk marched towards the woods. He walked with majesty, his flag of truce held high, and not even Albert Roberge the trapper blocked his way. In awe, all watched him disappear into the bushes. Tante Odette was delighted, the others amazed. They gathered around René Eclette. "How did you get him to come out?" asked André Drouillard. "What did you say to him?" asked Jean Labadie. René Eclette hung his head and swung his arms back and forth because he was not used to such admiring attention from the people of the parish. At last he was persuaded to tell the secret. "I just told him that if he stayed in the oven any longer," he said, "he would begin to smell like Tante Odette's bread, and none of the other skunks would come near him." So you see, my friends, only the simple-minded René Eclette was wise enough to know that even a skunk, the lowliest of beasts, has his self-respect and values the good opinion of his own kind. And that is the story, the French-Canadian story, of the skunk in Tante Odette's oven. And, like I said, it's just a cute little tale, and I do enjoy it. It has a little moral at the end, and I do thank you once again, Liz, for sharing this book with us. It really is wonderful, and I will be telling more of these stories over time. But next week, we have one of our traditions, because in the United States at least, not in Canada, it is Thanksgiving next week. So we will have our annual Thanksgiving tradition. This is Dan Scholz for the Folktale Project. Don't forget that you can subscribe to the podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, anywhere that you like to get your podcasts. You can follow us on Instagram and Threads at Folktale Project. If you'd like to help support the project, you can head over to patreon.com/folktaleproject. Or you could always just share the stories with someone you love. I do appreciate that. As always, thank you so much for listening.